Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. And welcome to our witnesses and everyone joining us. Today we will examine demographic trends in the OSCE region, which is comprised by the 56 member states of the OSCE, every country of Europe and the former Soviet Union, as well as the United States and Canada. Dramatic demographic changes are already underway in the region, and there are sure to be dramatic consequences for the security, economic, and human dimensions of the OSCE. Lawmakers need to start thinking about how these and other changes will affect policies going forward. The fact is that most OSCE countries are in demographic decline, many of them in rapid decline. Only a handful of the OSCE's 56 member states are at or above replacement level. In many of them, military planners are asking the question on how or even whether they will be able to provide for their security in just a few generations, because that is the way demography works. Current birth rates pre-programs developments long into the futures. Likewise, with the economy, it is far from clear how in many of the most rapidly declining countries, how economic growth can be sustained by a declining population, or, to touch on the most pressing specific, how the numerically smaller younger generations will even begin to provide for the larger, older generations. As to the human dimension of the OSCE, it is alarming and sad to see xenophobic and ultra-nationalistic violence fueled by one's nation's perceptions of long-term decline vis-a-vis another group. Similarly, with migrants, when a country faced with a shrinking workforce calls on foreign workers who in difficult economic times find themselves discriminated against and targeted. It is particularly ugly when some dominant social groups respond to their own demographic decline by proposing to engineer a corresponding decline in other groups, whether this is proposed overtly by racist demagogues or covertly by groups of international elites adept at hiding their real intentions behind other ideologies. It is a factor in a number of OSCE countries today. I do look forward to our witnesses' testimony. This information, I think, will be very helpful as we approach the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly that will be held in Belgrade in just a couple of weeks from today, from now. And it'll also, I think, spur a larger discussion that has been largely missing in many of these countries. Some, yes, have begun to take some actions to reverse this decline, but in other cases, it is still not even on the radar screen. So I do thank all of you for being here, and I'd like to now introduce our witnesses. And I understand, Mr. Goldstone, you have to leave right away, or 2:30 or so? Okay. No, I understand. So let me just introduce you first with Dr. Jack Goldstein. And if I could ask Dr. Goldstein if he would just proceed first, and then I will introduce each of our other witnesses immediately after that. Dr. Jack A. Goldstein is the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Professor of Public Policy and an eminent scholar at the George Mason University School of Public Policy. Dr. Goldstone specializes in global and comparative history, political conflict, revolutions, and social movements, democratization, state building, demographic security, and comparative economic development. He serves as director of the Center for Global Policy at George Mason. Dr. Goldstone is a prolific researcher, author, and lecturer. There will be a period for questions immediately following, but again, if the other distinguished panelists would mind, Dr. Goldstein, if you could proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. It's my honor and pleasure to be here. I apologize that I do have to leave for another engagement at 2:30, but I will stay for your questions. There are many dimensions in which demography affects the interests of the OSCE nations. I'm going to focus in particular on migration issues and leave some of the security issues to my distinguished colleagues who are also testifying here today. The OSCE, I'm very pleased to be here to discuss because I strongly believe in the values of openness, freedom, and protection of human rights that the OSCE was designed to protect. And indeed, it is a bulwark against the racism, xenophobic nationalism, and state abuses that brought us the gulags, World War II, and the Holocaust and other horrors of the 20th century. It is unfortunate that at present we see some resurgence of this xenophobic nationalism, even covert racism, brought on by changes in demography and particular issues of migration, and particularly to Western Europe. Now, the world is changing rapidly. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, the demography of Europe has changed. Let me highlight that drama. For most of the last 500 years, European populations were booming and indeed were countries of outward migration, sending peoples to the Americas and even to colonize parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, the Middle East. Whatever we may think of these colonial and imperial ventures today, and their record is certainly mixed at best, it's much more difficult to conceive of a Europe that would have grown without this massive out-migration. We might have seen a Europe that was overrun, impoverished, and lacking all of the new ideas, the new products and resources that were brought in by greater communication with the world. It is now ironic but also difficult for Europeans to grasp that their numbers are now stagnant or in decline, and other parts of the world are growing both in numbers and in the wealth and cosmopolitan attitudes that enable outward migration. So Europe finds itself now as the recipient of migrants to a greater degree than it has in its history. Now, I want to tell you in my comments that I think this is both necessary and beneficial for Europe. But I will point out that because Europeans have not thought of themselves as a country needing immigration, they have treated migrants from abroad as foreigners, visitors, guest workers, without dedicating themselves to the effort needed to integrate and assimilate foreigners. Now, the United States, within the OSCE, can, I believe, serve as a model of the type of benefits that accrue to a country that is open to migration. As we'll see, the need for migration is strong in Europe. If they reject it, and this will be strong not only in Europe, but frankly throughout the OSCE region, bad things will happen. The economies will struggle to survive. So the role of the US and Canada as countries of immigration, built and strengthened by immigration, is critical in the OSCE. But in order to play that leadership role, I believe the US still needs to overcome some of its own issues and confusions in its own migration policy, which, as you know, is a topic of debate here on the Hill as we speak. But I hope things will move forward there. Let me simply go to the arithmetic that lies behind my concerns of the need for migration in Europe. If we could see the first slide, please. Thank you. Demographic projections can often be a welter of confusing figures. I've decided to focus on one simple number, and that is the ratio between people in the prime working years from age 15 to 59 and seniors who are 60 and older. A healthy society, the number of workers is, of course, much larger than the number of seniors. And indeed, in the United States, for example, the 1970s, the numbers were about 4 to 1. They've since started to decline. As you see here in this figure, if we look at the ratio of workers per senior in selected OSCE countries in 2010, there's quite a substantial range. On the low end, Italy and Germany barely have 2 workers for every senior today. The United Kingdom, France, Spain, and Hungary are somewhat better, closer to 3. But these are already dangerous levels. It's very hard to sustain the health care and the pensions for an older population if there are only 2 workers per senior. The U.S. is comfortably above 3 today, as are Romania, Russia, Poland, and the further eastern countries in the OSCE, like Turkey and Kazakhstan, have quite a strong surplus of young workers. So it's no surprise that today's migration patterns in the OSCE are dominated by the movement of workers from the East, both Eastern Europe and Middle East, Central Asia, and Turkey, to Western Europe. That's the pattern that's been prevailing for the last decade and will probably be strong for the next decade or 2 as well. However, in the future, even this flow will not resolve the labor issues, because if we jump ahead to the next slide, we look at these numbers for 2050. And if you'll notice, the left-hand scale has now contracted. Whereas previously I could show numbers from 0 to 7 or 8, we're now looking from 0 to 3, because much of the world is coming to look like Europe in terms of its fertility behavior. We're seeing a convergence as countries grow richer and more prosperous and more urban, people have fewer children. But the trend is dramatic and strong. Italy and Germany will be heading toward only 1 worker for every senior by the middle of the century. Spain, Romania, and Poland, which had been sources of outmigration, will be down below 1.5. The United Kingdom, France, Hungary, doing better, but still between 1.5 to 2 workers per senior. Those are still crisis levels for a government committed to taking care of its elderly population. The United States and Turkey will be at 2, not 3, and this is still a level that requires policy attention. 2 workers per senior means some adjustments need to be made in taxation and benefits if a system is to remain stable, another topic of debate on the Hill these days. Even Kazakhstan will find only half as many workers per senior as it has today. The obvious response is going to be migration from outside the OSCE region. Countries of North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and even East Asia will be anxious to supply immigrants to meet the labor needs of Europe, and Europe will desperately need additional workers. I want to say, this doesn't mean a tidal wave of foreign workers that will overwhelm the domestic populations. Right now, most European countries have a foreign-born population of under 10%. Were this to double in the next 20 to 30 years, it would go far toward meeting the needs for more young laborers. And combined with an uptick in fertility and a higher workforce participation rate by those in their working years and moving into their late 60s and early 70s, Europe should be in good shape. However, it will take advances in all 3 areas, that is, higher fertility, greater workforce participation and longer working careers, and increases in migration to avert a demographic implosion, which is what appears to be on the books now if no action is taken. Now, let me also say that I know that this will not be an easy step for Europeans to take. There have already been frictions with regard to multiculturalism and immigration, as there are frictions in the United States. But it's important to focus on the gains. Migrants have brought to the Europe and Canada outstanding performers in the sciences, in the arts, in business, in politics. We would be a far poorer nation, less diverse, less innovative, less rich in ideas without our migrants. And in those countries where voices are being raised warning that migration means an end to domestic values, the United States and Canada need to gently remind our colleagues that it is possible to combine pluralism and a variety of peoples with dedication to a single set of values. Europe's greatest strength in the core of the OSCE principles is a commitment to protection of basic human rights, openness, and freedom. Those values do provide the foundation for people of different cultures and different faiths to work together and create stronger societies. Let me stop there. I'd be glad to take questions. And thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Dr. Goldstein, thank you very much, and I will be brief, I know, because you have to leave. You know, you stop at 2050. Do your projections go beyond that? You know, especially as it relates, like Turkey goes from 7 to 1 to joining the United States at about 2 to 1.
Right.
Does that trend continue to worsen, or is there a turnaround at some point?
The trend within all OSCE nations, as far as we can tell, is for a convergence on lower fertility rates. Now, whether or not nations will follow Italy and Germany down to very low sub-replacement rates, or whether they will end up closer to replacement, is hard to tell today. My guess is that more countries will end up closer to replacement rate than to the population contraction rates that we're seeing in some OSCE countries. However, the process of moving from a growing population to a stable population inevitably entails a period in which the number of seniors starts to grow more rapidly than the number of workers. And so that problem of making the transition and maintaining equity and government fiscal stability during that transition, that will probably increase for all the OSCE countries. After 2050, the problem will become less acute because we'll have seen the worst of it coming in the next 40 years. And if we have made the adjustment to providing equity for seniors and balancing migration, then the period from 2050 to 2100 should be a matter of applying lessons learned and continuing to do all right.
Let me ask you just briefly, you point out, or you've argued, that demographic changes translates into global security concerns, undermining perhaps NATO and other important organizations and obviously what undergirds them, the countries themselves. Would you speak briefly to the security implications?
Yes, of course.
And then the issue of the Islamic populations, which tend not to follow, I would think, the people of other faiths in the area, in the region, I should say. They're not likely to follow the demographic implosion, are they? And what does that mean, implication-wise?
The good news is, yes, even most Muslim and Middle Eastern countries are moving toward lower fertility. In the long run, they are likely to converge with the trends that we see in the more advanced industrial countries. But they are several decades behind, and it's our lives in the next few decades that we need to be concerned about. With regard to security, if one looks at the population of the world as a whole, I'm fond of telling people the age distribution is about what it was in the United States in 1970, which was a healthy age distribution that was the foundation for decades of economic growth. The problem is if you then separate the rich countries from the poor ones, we find the rich countries will have a preponderance of seniors, creating an obstacle to continued economic growth, whereas the poorer nations will have a predominance of very young people, creating challenges of education, productivity, and keeping social order intact if the aspirations of those young people are not met.
We know for a fact that the Chinese government is facing a huge demographic implosion owing to the fact that seniors will soon just overwhelm children and young adults based on the one-child per capita
Yes, the good news for us is that the concerns that China's economy will rapidly overtake that of the U.S. are unlikely to be realized because of the demographic decline. What this means, though, is that China will start to stabilize, and the globe will kind of break into groups, North America, Europe, China, that are coping with demographic decline, facing large regions of the world with still rapid population growth and large numbers of young people that frankly will be facing intermittent turmoil. The Arab revolts were fueled in large part by high rates of unemployment among the young, and we are seeing those high rates of unemployment among the young in many regions of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Middle East. And as you will hear from my colleagues, the military resources to cope with disorder around the globe will also be strained by the aging and fiscal problems in Western countries.
Just two final very brief questions. Any thoughts on the future of some of the small countries like Georgia, Bulgaria, Estonia? What does their future look like? Will they go away over time? And secondly, with regards to unfunded liability, we know for a fact Social Security and Medicare are in huge trouble here in the United States. Europe obviously has very similar mechanisms for their older population. Are they facing a similar catastrophic outcome like we are?
Right. If you'll forgive me for trying to be nuanced here on this, Europe's problem of pensions and health care is complicated by the fact that they are aging faster than the United States. However, their health care costs are much less and under better control than ours. The United States, because of the large baby boom, is actually facing a larger percentage increase in the elderly. That is, Europeans' old population may grow by 50% in the next few decades. Americans will double by 2050. We'll have more young people to support them, but the sheer number of elderly people will overwhelm our healthcare system if we do not get costs under control. So I would say Europe and the U.S. both have their problems. They're both a little different. For the smaller countries with very low growth rates, will they disappear? I don't think that's likely. I think it's likely that reproduction rates will gradually return to closer to replacement. However, they will go through a period of decline, and they will lose energy and innovation unless they open themselves up to new influences. We've seen Japan in its lost decade not only lose a decade of economic growth, but young people there have lost energy, they've lost optimism, they've lost faith in the future, and it's an example of what can happen if a country thinks it can face a demographic decline without renewing its energy from outside influences.
Thank you. Dr. Gozon, thank you so much for your testimony. And
It's been my pleasure.
appreciate it. Hope
Thank
you
you.
made your deadline. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt, who is the Henry Wendt Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. A political economist and a demographer by training, he holds numerous positions, including service as a member of the Global Leadership Council at the World Economic Forum. He researches and writes extensively on economic development, foreign aid, global health, demographics, and poverty. Dr. Eberstadt is the author of numerous monographs and articles on North and South Korea, East Asia, and countries of the former Soviet Union. A prolific author of one of his most recent books is entitled Russia's Peacetime Demographic Crisis. We will then hear from Dr. Richard Jackson, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he directs the Global Aging Initiative, a research program that explores the economic, social, and geopolitical implications and demographic trends in the United States and around the world. Dr. Jackson is involved in numerous related projects, including demographics and geopolitics in the 21st century, future of U.S. immigration, GAI past projects, Global Aging Initiative, Global Aging Preparedness Index, Global Aging Vulnerability Index. Among his many books is a recent publication, The Graying of the Great Powers, Demography and Geopolitics in the 21st Century. And lastly, we will hear from Stephen Mosher, who is president of the Population Research Institute, is an internationally recognized authority on China and population issues, an acclaimed author and speaker, and president of the Population Research Institute. He has worked tirelessly since 1979 to fight coercive population control programs and helped hundreds of thousands of women and families worldwide over the years. Mr. Mosher has appeared numerous times before Congress as an expert on world population, China, and human rights abuses. He has appeared before many TV shows, including 60 Minutes, Good Morning America, Today Show 2020, and his latest book is entitled Population Control, Real Costs, Illusionary Benefits. So, Dr. Eberstadt, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished co-panelists and guests, it's a privilege and honor to be here today. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to submit to the record a longer version of my remarks, a study that I prepared with my AEI colleague, Apurva Shah.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I'm going to talk in the next few minutes about the demographic circumstances and outlook for the OSCE's most populous country, the Russian Federation. Demographers are often chided for seeming to be excessively gloomy, for finding the cloud around any sort of silver lining. But when we look at the situation in Russia today, we have to see the makings and prospect for a real demographic crisis, and a most peculiar sort of crisis, because it is a peacetime crisis for an educated and urbanized society. It has humanitarian implications, but I believe it also has economic and security implications. And with your indulgence, I will run through some slides which I hope can illustrate what I mean more vividly than my few words. Can we move to the first slide, please? Since the end of the communist era, Russia has seen 13 million more deaths than births. There have been 3 deaths for every 2 births in Russia over the past roughly 20 years. If this is all one knew about that society, one would think this was a place in the midst of a prolonged famine or total war. Yet, as I mentioned, this is a peacetime, educated, urbanized society. Next slide, please. Thanks to net in-migration, Russia's population decline has been cushioned somewhat, but only somewhat. Russia's absolute numbers have dropped by at least 6 million, over the last 2 decades, probably the largest peacetime decline in any human population since the catastrophic consequences and aftermath of China's Great Leap Forward. Next slide, please. So what exactly is going on? The problem, the driver of this situation in Russia is not in particular a collapse in births, although births have dropped in Russia. Russia's fertility patterns look quite European when put in a larger context. Russia is a sub-replacement European society, but its fertility levels, absolute levels, do not look so different from other developed societies. Next slide, please. What we see in Russia is that childbearing has been at a below replacement level for a very long time, for perhaps 2 generations at least, since for the women born in the 1930s and since. And next slide, please. And fertility levels throughout Russia's ethnicities are perhaps surprisingly low. Chechens are seen in Russia as being famously prolific, but even in Chechnya, birth levels are apparently only at about 3 births per woman per lifetime, somewhat similar to, perhaps less than, Mexican Americans in our own society. The dramatic finding, I think, that one sees is that almost all groups within Russia, almost including, quote, Muslim heritage groups, have below replacement fertility, and Russian ethnics within Russia have one of the very lowest levels of fertility. Next slide, please. There's a great deal of interest within Russia and outside Russia about the population of Islamic or Muslim heritage. These numbers are very difficult to specify with any precision. One study which has attempted to do this suggests that maybe 10% of Russia's population comes from groups that have traditional Muslim cultural heritages, which does not necessarily mean that all of the people are believers or practicing if they are adherents. Next slide, please. So this means that Russia's population of people with Muslim backgrounds would be somewhat higher than any in Western Europe, but the comparisons are somewhat difficult to make for historical reasons. The, quote, Muslim population in Russia, having been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, Western Europe's, quote, Muslim population being newcomers or second, third generation populations. Next slide, please. It's impossible to make accurate forecasts in the future for a population. That being said, there are factors which are pushing fertility prospects down for Russia in the future. One of these is a change in marital patterns. Divorce is coming to Russia with alacrity, let's say. And as in Western Europe, next slide, please, we can see that the proportion of children born outside of marriages is increasing quite vigorously. Both of these factors tend to press down on average childbearing levels, especially in places where welfare states are very poorly developed for child support. Next slide, please. So in those ways, Russia looks quite European. When one looks at Russia's health situation, one might say there's a big difference. The outlook and prospect might be considered third world. And in some ways, you'll see that that sort of a comparison is unfair to third world countries. Unlike any Western European countries, Russia has had a health catastrophe. There's no other word for it. Russia's life expectancy level is a little bit lower now than it was 50 years ago. And if we look at the actual trends that have evolved, per capita, age standardized death levels are over twice as high as in Western Europe. They're 50% higher than in the former Soviet bloc countries of the new EU, which were similar to Russia only a generation ago. There are two drivers behind this health catastrophe. Next slide, please. One is cardiovascular deaths, and Russia's level of death from heart disease is over twice as high as would be predicted by the country's income level. Difficult, but apparently not impossible. The other, next slide please, is deaths from injury and so-called external causes, homicide, suicide, things like that, poisonings. Russia's level is 5 times as high as Western Europe's in this regard. Next slide, please. And if all one knew about Russia were its level of deaths from injury, violence, external deaths, one would presume that Russia was a sub-Saharan conflict or post-conflict state. It is a complete outlier from the rest of the developed world's experience. Next slide, please. To make matters even worse, Russia's health disaster is concentrated in its working age population. For men between their late 20s and late 50s, death rates are typically 100%, and I said 100%, higher than they were 40 years ago. And for women, death rates are typically 50% higher than they were 40 years ago. Next slide, please. One sense one can get of the fragility of the Russian workforce's health status is by comparing death rates for Russian men at age 30 with death rates for, let's say, Dutch men at different ages. As of more or less today, a Dutch man who is age 58 has a lower risk of mortality in the coming year than a guy from Russia who is 30 years old. It is an enormously health-challenged population. Let's look at the next slide, please. And this is true for older people in Russia as well. Their health levels are much more tenuous than those of their Western European comparators. Next slide, please. Russia has a very badly underfunded social security system. It makes our social security discussions look like a bagatelle, raising the whole question about what is to become of a sick, frail, and poor senior population in Russia in the decades immediately ahead. Next slide, please. In doing my research, I thought that Russia's education system would be the redeeming virtue that one would find in this otherwise grim human resource system. Unfortunately, not so. If one takes a look at the numbers of patents awarded for inventions generated in different countries, one finds that Russia is orders of magnitude lower than the G7, orders of magnitude lower than most of the BRICS, and even lower than some of the tiny East Asian tigers. The place that most closely tracks Russia year for year in total patent awards is the state of West Virginia. And there are many redeeming things about the state of West Virginia, but it is not known as a knowledge center in the United States. And it has a tiny population in relation to Russia's huge population. Next slide, please. If one tries to do more detailed comparisons, one can see that Russia is punching below its weight in knowledge generation in any sort of way one tends to make the comparison. And this is not true of all post-communist societies. China, for example, is punching well above its weight. Next slide, please. And we can see the same thing from other metrics. So what does this all mean for the long run? Next slide, please. All of the prognoses from different demographic authorities, from our Census Bureau, from the United Nations Population Division, even from Russia's Goskomstat, sees excess death over birth and population decline more or less as far as a demographer's eye can go. And this is, next slide, please. And pressures for fewer births are going to continue to come as the cohort of women moving into childbearing ages collapses, an echo of previous births in recent past. Next slide, please. Russia's working age labor force is on the way down. It is on track to shrink by about 20% over the next 20 years. Next slide, please. And no less dramatically, Russia's urban population is shrinking. Russia is the most prominent place in the world where the total number of people living in cities is on a downward spiral. Cities are the growth engines of a modern global economy. Next slide, please. And in Russia's urban centers, health levels are lower than in urban centers in China, in Brazil, in Egypt, in Indonesia, even in India. So, thus, we have a tremendous challenge for eliciting economic growth. Next slide, please. Russia also has immense and unavoidable demographic constraints in mustering military manpower. Russia's manpower of military ages is set to shrink by about 50% over the period of 2005 to 2020. Next slide, please. And Russia has vast open spaces. Think of the Russian Far East. The Russian Far East has over 6 million square kilometers and fewer than 6 million people inhabiting. It is more densely populated than Antarctica. It is more densely populated than the Sahara Desert. It is not more densely populated than the Amazonia or Mongolia. Next and final slide, please. And to make matters even more interesting, people are moving out of Siberia. Russian citizens are moving out of Siberia, not in. How is Russia going to maintain the sovereignty and integrity of this area in the future? Many Russian demographers wonder whether this is possible. I'll stop right there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eberstadt. Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is an honor to have the opportunity to testify on this important topic. I also have a longer version of my remarks, which, with your permission, I'd like read into the record.
Will be made part of the record.
Thank you very much. The world stands on the threshold of a stunning demographic transformation that's often called global aging, and which promises to reshape the geopolitical order in dramatic and profound ways. By the 2020s, much of the developed world will be entering a new era of hyper-aging and population decline. May I have the first? We do have the first slide. Very good. Hyper-aging and population decline. Many countries will experience fiscal crisis, economic stagnation, and ugly political battles over old age benefit cuts and immigration. Meanwhile, the developing world will be rocked potentially by its own demographic storms. Mr. Chairman, as you've mentioned, China is a rapidly aging society. It faces its own massive age wave, which it may not be able to afford. At the other end of the spectrum, many other developing countries, particularly in the Muslim world, will face a new resurgence of youth in the 2020s, whose aspirations they may not be able to meet. So we're moving towards a future where potentially we have a weakening of the capacity of the United States and its traditional developed world allies to maintain security, even as we have a series of new demographically driven risks and potential threats on the horizon. There is, of course, significant variation in the demographic outlook within the rich world. At the one extreme is the United States. We are the youngest of the rich countries, and despite the retirement of our baby boom, thanks to our relatively high fertility rate and substantial net immigration, we will be the youngest by an even wider margin in 2030 or 2040 or 2050. At the other extreme is Japan. While the elder share of our population will rise from 13 to 20%, Japan's on current trend is on track to reach 39%. Europe lies somewhere in between, but within Europe itself there is very significant variation. And what I would call your attention to in particular in this slide is that the outlook in France and Northern Europe, including the Low Countries, Scandinavia, and the UK, though challenging, is not dire. In the rest of Europe, fertility rates are much lower, the aging trend much more severe, and whereas Northern Europe is looking at population stagnation, the rest of Europe is looking at very steep population decline. Next slide, please. And if you would bring up all the bullets, thank you. This demographic shift promises to impose significant constraints on the economic and geopolitical capacity of the rich countries, and there are four in particular that I'd like to focus on briefly. The first is the prospect of emerging manpower shortages as youth populations stagnate or decline. The second is the growing fiscal burden of rising retirement and healthcare costs. The third, the prospect of slower economic growth. And finally, the question of how the aging of populations and also growing diversity within populations may affect not just the capacity of societies to maintain security commitments, but also their willingness. Next slide, please. The manpower issue is an important issue, and it's usually the first that one thinks of when one thinks of countries with aging and declining populations. The service age population, because population decline is being driven by sub-replacement fertility and the hollowing out of the base of the population pyramid, the service age population will be more slowly growing or more rapidly contracting than the total population. And as you can see, among the G7 countries, the United States is the only country that will experience any significant growth in the service age population between now and the middle of the century. The demographic trends themselves could be exacerbated by growing competition for relatively scarce youth with tighter civilian labor markets. Some people might object that these manpower shortages don't matter as much today as they did in the past as we move towards further into an era of high-tech militaries. But I think if there are many lessons perhaps to be drawn from Iraq and Afghanistan, but one is clearly that boots on the ground matter. And in any case, the second challenge, which is the rising fiscal burden of an aging population, will limit the capacity of countries to respond to emerging manpower shortages by substituting military capital for military labor. Next slide, please. Here we come back to, if we can back, oh yes, this is right, thank you. We come back to Professor Goldstone's support ratio of working age adults to elders. Falling fertility and rising longevity translate directly into a falling support ratio of working age adults to elders, and a falling support ratio translates in turn into a rising cost rate for pay-as-you-go social insurance systems, like Social Security or like Medicare. In a series of projections we've done at CSIS, we calculate that the cost of maintaining the current deal for seniors, given the shift in the support ratio, would increase old age benefit spending by, on average, 10% of GDP across the rich countries between now and 2040, and by more. Next slide, please. You can see the projected growth in this slide compared with current defense spending as a share of GDP. There are very few developed countries that have much tax room to pay for a significant, whatever one's views on the proper size, the optimal size of government, or the optimal tax burden. There are literally very few countries that could raise taxes enough to pay for a significant share of this extra cost growth. And that is particularly true in Europe, where many countries are already at or beyond the efficient taxation threshold, meaning that raising the tax rate would simply drive more workers into a growing gray economy. Countries will have to reduce benefits, but efforts to do that are likely to meet growing political resistance from aging electorates, who in most European countries are much more dependent on these public benefit systems than seniors are in the United States. So what happens when when politicians and policymakers face a choice between an economically ruinous tax hike and a politically impossible benefit cut? Well, all too often, one of two other things happen. You cannibalize the rest of the budget, or you let deficits grow that undermine national savings. Next slide, please. It's not just a fiscal challenge. It's also a challenge of slower economic growth. And when I confidently state that demographic trends, particularly in Japan and Europe, but also in the United States, will lead to slower GDP growth in the future, I'm sometimes accused of pessimism. But this is not pessimism. This is really simple arithmetic. GDP growth is employment growth, or more precisely, the growth in hours worked times the growth in output per hour. And what this table shows is that the underlying rate of growth in the working age population is falling rapidly and turning negative. In Europe, we are looking at best at stagnation in France and the UK, and in the faster aging countries like Germany and Italy, a sharply contracting working age population. So unless productivity accelerates at least as fast as the rate of growth in employment falls, we're looking at slower economic growth, and in some countries we are actually looking at the prospect of secular economic stagnation. That is, no growth in aggregate GDP across the business cycle. There is some reason to fear that rather than productivity growing more rapidly, the aging of the population may actually pull productivity down, because as more of the population enters the harvest years, rates of savings and investment are likely to decline. And also, though it pains me to say this personally, it's not just the world that's aging. I am also, but there is a large literature in the social and behavioral sciences which suggests that productivity generally declines at older ages, particularly in environments of rapid technological and market change. It's simply harder for older workers to adjust. And this difficulty, the higher adjustment costs of an aging society, may also increase the risk of a protectionist backlash. Historically, expanding populations and expanding markets have gone hand in hand with free trade, whereas, think of the 1930s, contracting markets have gone hand in hand with beggar-than-neighbor protectionism. Next slide, please. Here we leave entirely the realm of quantifiable social science and become more speculative. But it's at least worth reflecting on how the shift in the age structure of society may affect the overall mood of society. What this somewhat puzzling chart depicts is the share of the population in each of the G7 countries with less than 20 years of life remaining between 1950 and 2050. So, if you will, it's a proxy for the share of the population that has most of its life in the past tense and relatively little in the future tense. We know that behavior changes in certain characteristic ways across the individual life cycle. Yes, perhaps we know a risk-taking 85-year-old entrepreneur, and perhaps we know a risk-averse 25-year-old, but behavior changes in typical ways on average and for purely rational reasons. At older ages, we have less time left to enjoy the benefits of risky investments and less time left to recoup the losses. So the question is, does the overall behavior of societies and of electorates become more risk-averse, more small c conservative, if you will, more prone to favor current consumption over investments in the future, more prone to make ad hoc settlements instead of face decisive confrontations. Next slide, please, and I will wrap up quickly. Although population size alone does not confer geopolitical stature, no one disputes that population size and economic size together constitute a powerful double engine of national power. A larger population allows greater numbers of young adults to serve in war and occupy and pacify territory. A larger economy allows more spending on the hard power of national defense and the semi-hard power of foreign assistance. It can also enhance what political scientist Joseph Nye calls soft power by promoting business dominance, leverage with NGOs and philanthropies, social envy and emulation, and cultural clout in the global media and popular culture. The population of the developed world club has been for decades now and will continue to be a steeply declining share of the global total. Note, however, that the United States roughly maintains its global population share over the next half-century. Next slide, please. The trend in the developed world share of global GDP, these are projections we made as a part of our Graying of the Great Powers project. The trend in developed world share of global GDP, and particularly Europe's and Japan's share, the decline is even steeper. The U.S. share does decline somewhat, but not nearly to the same extent as that of our traditional allies does. Next slide. So we come to the consequence of what my colleague Nicholas Eberstadt sometimes calls U.S. demographic exceptionalism. The corollary to the demographic and relative demographic and economic decline of the rest of the developed world is that the United States will be a sharply rising share of the overall population and GDP of the developed world. And in fact, in our projections, by the 2030s, the relative dominance of the United States in the developed world is back to about where it was in 1950 at the beginning of the Pax Americana. Yes, the United States faces very significant fiscal and economic challenges. As has already been stressed, we have an extraordinarily expensive health system, which will become a growing handicap as the population ages. We have a very low national savings rate, near rock bottom in the developed world, and in part as a consequence of that, a high and growing level of dependence on foreign capital. We also, sadly, have a political economy which sometimes finds it difficult to make resource trade-offs between competing priorities. The whole question of ruinous tax hikes and politically impossible benefit cuts. But at the end of the day, if we can overcome these obstacles, the United States will have the youth and the economic resources to play a major geopolitical role, and in fact, we will be the only rich country that does, which suggests that far from being in relative decline, we're moving into a future in which the world will need us more, not less. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for that very thorough, and you, Dr. Epperstadt, as well, assessment. And before I go to Stephen Mosher, just remind my colleagues who will read this record, we will disseminate this very, very widely, because I think this is one of those issues that is potentially catastrophic, especially if we pay no attention to it, or too little attention. So, again, your information, which we will share with our members of Parliament in the OSCE EPA, as well as with the OSCE itself, is very, very helpful. So I do thank you so much for it. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mosher, please proceed. Without objection, it will be made a part of the record.
At work here, I will not pit anthropology's poor spears against Professor Eberstadt and Jackson's demographic statistical juggernaut. But I would say that this is the first time I have ever been on a panel discussing the issue of population when the word overpopulation has not once arisen, because we're all concerned today about not what may have seemed to have been the case in 1960 and 1970, but what is actually the real situation on the ground today in this decade, in this century. The real population crises we face today is not a population explosion, but a population implosion in country after country around the world. The old demographic transition charts that I learned back in the 1960s when I first went to college showed birth rates leveling off precisely at the replacement rate. Everything was going to be fine. The mortality rate would decline first, then the fertility rate would follow. Everyone would wind up with a perfect family of a boy for me and a girl for you, and heaven help us if we have three. That is obviously not the case. The family of even two children has been scorned by many moderns on their way to extinction, and the declining number of traditional families has been unable to fill the fertility gap thus created. I recall Peter Drucker, who was a colleague of mine out at Claremont Colleges. The late management guru wrote way back in 1997 that, quote, the dominant factor for business in the next 2 decades, absent war, pestilence, or collision with a comet, is not going to be economics or technology, it will be demographics. Now, he was concerned with the increasing underpopulation of developed countries, but decades later, a decade and a half later, this has spread to many countries in the less developed world, and is truly a global phenomenon affecting all OSCE countries and all OSCE partners. There is a sentiment out there, which I think I saw reflected in the 2010 revision of the UN Population Division, where in their medium variant they felt somehow that fertility rates were going to swing upward again. And their median variant is actually based on the very optimistic, in my view, rosy projection that people in countries with low fertility will suddenly raise their total fertility rate back up to replacement. A few years ago, the median variant was based on this sentimental rise in fertility rates up to 1.85. Now it's based on a rise in fertility rates up to about 2.1. They give no reason for this optimism, and I can see none. It does, however, make the population projections that they put out somewhat more robust than they would otherwise be. I believe the real numbers will be lower. They have been lower for the last few decades. The low variant seems to be the best predictor of future population. I went to Japan for the first time in 1972 as an officer with the U.S. Navy at the tail end of the Vietnam War. And, of course, the Japanese economic boom was well underway by that time. Industry was flourishing under the guidance of long-range vision plans issued by elite bureaucrats in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. The salarymen were grinding away at their usual 70-hour work week. Economic growth was consistently running at 4 to 5% a year, and Japan's trade surplus with the U.S. was surging towards the $100 billion mark, which seemed a lot at the time. A decade later, my colleague Ezra Vogel from Harvard wrote a book called Japan is Number One, telling Americans that we were falling behind because of our lack of Japanese-style central direction and government and business cooperation. We should, he said, adopt policies more suited to the post-industrial age. It wasn't long after Japan is Number One was published, and of course it wasn't just Professor Vogel. Everyone was looking to Japan to overtake the United States in those years. The Japanese economy ran into a demographic brick wall. Economic growth stalled, averaging an anemic 1% growth for most of the 90s. During the Asian economic downturn of 1998, Japan's GNP actually shrank by 2.8%. Never number one, Japan soon slipped to fourth behind the EU and China. What's going on here, of course, is now since 1964, the Japanese total fertility rate has been below replacement. The Japanese, for over 4 decades now, have been having too few children to replace the current population. During the 1990s, Japanese journalists invented a term, demographic shock. In 1993, the demographic shock was that the birth rate was only 1.53 children per woman. It has fallen since then, hovering around 1.3, 1.4 now. The voluntary childlessness of the Japanese exceeds even the forced-paced population reduction in China's one-child policy. Back in 1996, Yamada Masahiro of Gakugei University said that Japan was entering the world's first low birth rate recession. So here we have a depopulation crisis that has already forced Japan to slash pensions, to raise the retirement age from 60 to 65 to keep pension funds afloat. We've had earlier discussion of what's happening in demographic terms, so I won't dwell on the numbers. But Japan is suffering today from the 4 Ds. It is suffering from debt, from deflation, and from declining demographics. And the latter two, declining demographics, is ultimately responsible for the first two. It is difficult to see how Japan can pay off its national debt of 200% of GDP with a declining and aging population. In reaction to this, the government has been encouraging older people to rejoin the workforce and more women to take jobs. They have been focused on the development of industrial robots and, to some extent, encouraging immigration to keep the economy growing. Each of these proposed measures, however, is either a temporary stopgap measure or, in some sense, self-defeating. The newly rehabilitated elderly, of course, will soon be forced to retire again, this time for good. And as for women joining the workforce in greater numbers, of course, everyone is in favor of giving women every opportunity. But this will surely drive the birth rate down even more and exacerbate the labor shortage over time even further. It would take an estimated 600,000 immigrants a year to offset the impending decline in the labor force, and an influx of such magnitude would shake Japan's homogeneous and insular monoculture to the core. What can a country like Japan do to reverse the declining birth rate? The Japanese government has been studying this question now for 5 years and continues to repeatedly revisit the same old solutions, which I do not believe will at all turn around this demographic collapse that we see. The crisis of the empty cradle has crept upon us quietly. We have not reached a stable equilibrium of low mortality rates and low birth rates. Instead, once people are educated, urbanized, and begin to enjoy a certain level of wealth, birth rates plummet. More and more couples live in urban conditions where children provide no economic benefits, but rather are, as the Chinese say, goods on which one loses. I studied my dissertation research back in the 1970s was a comparative analysis of a fishing and farming community in Taiwan and a close look at the economic value of children who, because they were not allowed on fishing boats, were of less economic value to the fishermen than to the farmers, who could put them to work in the fields at a relatively early age. And, of course, the birth rate in the fishing village was lower. Education delays marriage even further. For materially minded couples in countries where the state provides old age benefits, the way to get ahead is to remain perpetually childless. Why give up a second income to bring a child into the world who will never, at least in material terms, repay your investment? Why provide for your future in the most fundamental way by providing the next generation if the government has pledged to keep you out of the poorhouse in your old age anyway? So the modern nanny state has created a strange new world in which the most successful individuals in material terms are the most unfit in biological terms. Wealth and children no longer go together. Wealth used to make it possible to marry earlier, to bring more children into the world and ensure that more of these children survived. But no longer. Cradle-to-grave welfare systems found in developed countries, along with the heavy tax burden these demand, have made the care and feeding of children superfluous to wealth. In fact, they have made children wealth's enemy. I have the example of Korea before me. In Korea, of course, back in 1961, Korea became one of the guinea pigs in the earliest population control campaigns carried out by our government. Along with Taiwan, South Korea was encouraged to embark upon a population stabilization program. The program quickly evolved into a de facto two-child per family policy, complete with strong punitive measures against those who dared violate this limit. Civil and military officials with more than 2 children were denied promotions and even demoted. Third and higher order children were declared ineligible for medical insurance coverage, educational opportunities, and other government benefits. Couples who agreed to sterilization were given priority access to scarce public housing. There did matters stand for 3 long decades. By the time the government of South Korea began to rethink this policy in the mid-90s, the fertility rate had dropped to an anemic 1.7 children. The population was aging rapidly, and a full-blown labor shortage had developed. You also had an epidemic of sex-selective abortions, where Confucian-minded parents anxious for sons were ending the lives of girl fetuses because of their gender. In 1996, the South Korean government finally got out of the population control business, announcing on June 4th that all restrictions on childbearing would be lifted. No new pronatal measures were enacted, however, until many years later. The South Korean population now has a TFR of 1.2 or thereabouts, and the South Korean population is beginning to shrink in absolute numbers. Would that we had left well enough alone in South Korea and in Taiwan, which also has a labor shortage, and would that we would now leave the Philippines alone. We are continuing to press through our embassy there for the Philippines to adopt a 2-child policy with some of the same measures that we saw earlier enacted in Taiwan and specifically in Korea. This because the Philippine people have the temerity to be averaging almost 3 children still, and a robust birth rate which provides immigrants to countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan to make up for the demographic shortfall there. The hundreds of millions of dollars that foreign agencies like USAID have poured into Korea's two-child policy, of course, is but a tiny fraction of the 100 billion or so that has been spent on fertility reduction programs in the world at large. Imagine putting billions of dollars into programs to undo the Industrial Revolution or the Information Revolution, and you will understand how our current approach makes no sense. We're making an old age tsunami even worse and causing a flood of human misery and global economic malaise at the same time. So I believe, Mr. Chairman, the sooner that we end population stabilization programs, fertility reduction programs, whatever you want to call them, family planning programs, the better. What should countries that are experiencing demographic decline do? Well, the European countries, which are in dire straits, all have child allowances in place. In the Germanic countries, it's called Kindergeld. But this relatively small amount of money that's given to parents of 1 or 2 or 3 children every month does not begin to compensate for the exactions of the state. I believe that one of the principal antenatal factors in the world today, and especially in countries that provide cradle-to-grave welfare systems, are tax rates that take over 50, even over 60% of a young couple's income. Now, if you reduce a young couple's income by nearly 60%, you leave them with so little disposable income that they postpone marriage, they postpone childbearing, and you ultimately reduce completed family size. So one thing that these countries, I believe, should do is when young couples have children, they should abandon the program of subsidies and instead move to a program where they protect young couples from all taxation. With 1 child, perhaps you would not pay, your taxes would be reduced by 1/3. With 2 children, reduced by 2/3. With 3 children, you would pay no taxes to the state because you would be in the business of paying the cost of raising future taxpayers, which are vital to the continued existence of retirement and pension programs, vital to the continued existence of the people itself. Governments can do many things, some well, many poorly, but governments cannot reproduce. Only people can do that. And young couples who are willing to provide for the future of countries in the most fundamental way by providing the future generation should be cherished and treasured. That is the message that I will be taking to Moscow next week when I go with Professor Eberstadt for the demographic summit there. It is a drastic measure, to be sure. It is not revenue neutral. It will pit tax breaks for the young against the increasing demands of the increasingly numerous elderly for the intergenerational compact to be, that the pledges they were given to be kept. But if these countries are to survive, I believe that such measures are certainly called for. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mosher, thank you very much for your testimony. And I would note for the record that it was back in the early 1980s that Stephen Mosher broke the story, literally broke the story about the horrific human rights abuse inherent in the one-child per couple policy in China. In 1984, I actually offered an amendment to our foreign aid authorization bill, which passed, that conditioned our aid on whether or not the UN Population Fund and any other non-governmental organization or multilateral organization was involved in supporting the forced abortion policy and the coercive population control policy of China. That led directly to the Kemp-Kasten language, which passed that same year. After we passed it on the authorizing bill, it then passed on the appropriations bill, where we lost in conference on my amendment. Jack Kemp and Senator Kasten prevailed, and that language has been the law of the land ever since, although it has not been implemented faithfully during this administration. But I would say to Stephen Mosher that it was his breakthrough research, which cost him a doctorate at Stanford. The Wall Street Journal even did a scathing editorial that called it Stanford morality, where they literally took away his ability to get his doctorate there because it may have put at risk the collaborative agreements between Stanford and the PRC, even though he broke a human rights story that nobody else was focusing upon. So I thank him for that past and the good work he does present. Let me ask just a few questions, and I'll ask Mark Balash, our Chief of Staff, if he has any questions either that he would like to pose. Let me just ask, first of all, in terms of Dr. Jackson, you brought up the fact that, relatively speaking, the United States is probably at least a bit better off than our European friends when it comes to this demographic winter. We know that much of our economy is based on exports. What's it? 1 out of every 8 jobs are contingent on exporting. But as those markets dry up because of lack of people and consuming people at that, what would be? I mean, has that been adequately factored into our government's projections? I know that, for example, the Congressional Budget Office has said that by 2021, our publicly owned debt will rise to $25.1 trillion with a T, and there are estimates of our unfunded liability over the next 75 years going upwards of $75, $76 trillion. I mean, these are numbers that are just beyond, I think, anyone's grasp. But if our ability to manufacture and export continues to dwindle, has that been adequately taken into the scenarios, sometimes more rosy than they should be, that OMB and others put out about our future?
Let me perhaps clarify and add just a little nuance to my rather optimistic take on the long-term economic future of the United States. We do face a very significant challenge, as was pointed out by my colleagues on the panel. We never become as old as Europe, but we will age very rapidly. And this is a result of our unusually large post-war baby boom. So all of the aging in the United States occurs between 2010 and 2030. There is a big fiscal shock associated with that very steep ramp up in the elder share of the population. So when the last of the boomers have passed on to that great Woodstock in the sky, we will be about as old as Italy and Japan are today. Nonetheless, we're going to grow old very rapidly over the next 20 years. And as I said, there's a big fiscal shock and there's a big labor market shock. We are a country that is accustomed to having a young and growing population and workforce, and we are also a country that is accustomed to limited government and a relatively small public sector. And the aging trend, particularly exacerbated by the rate of growth, rapid rate of growth in healthcare spending, calls all of that into question. So if unaddressed, we may at the end of the day end up not much better off than some of our faster aging allies in Europe or Japan, some of which, by the way, are moving more aggressively to reform pension systems and to address the challenge than we are. I think so. So yes, if one projects out current fiscal policy, this is a train wreck and a disaster, and that is probably not fully and adequately factored into into the projections.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to answer that? Dr. Eberstadt, let me ask you, or maybe all three of our panelists. Recently, Ted Turner, when he was at a global climate change summit in Cancun, Mexico, suggested that we need a world of one child per couple policies that would parallel what the Chinese has done to its own women and children and men. I would note for the record that I've chaired 29 hearings on human rights abuses in China, in whole or in part, focused on the issue of the one child per couple policy, and the fact that they are experiencing now gendercide and have been for years, the missing girls. Some put it as high as 100 million missing girls. Nobody knows for sure. And as Dr. Eberstadt pointed out recently at a press conference, and another academic leader in population issues, the impact on men looking for wives, they're just not there. They've been systematically eliminated pursuant to the one-child per couple policy. But my question is really focused, and however you want to answer it, of course. Lester Brown from World Watch has said that we need a world of one-child per couple policies. And I find, in talking to people at the United Nations, and I do it all the time, last week had several meetings with UN bureaucrats and leaders, you hear constantly this mantra. Stephen Mosier mentioned a moment ago, this is the first hearing where he hasn't heard an emphasis on overpopulation. The zeitgeist in the policy world seems to be overpopulation is still a serious problem. The sooner we get down to a one child or two child, or as we see as was brought out in the Philippines, a two-child per couple policy, the better. And it seems like they're missing all of or most of these implications to the family, the impact on war and peace. I don't know how many of you have read the Bear Branches book, the thesis of which is that, there could be a war in China simply because they have a restless male population. So I just, how do we shatter this myth, if it is a myth, of Brown, Ted Turner, and others that children are bad. They need to be gotten rid of, prevented, or destroyed.
Well, Mr. Chairman, whatever you'd call it, the secular religion, the non-religious, deterministic faith in antenatal population policy is very strongly rooted now in a lot of institutions. It's made a march through the institutions over the past generation or so into a lot of places in the United Nations, into a lot of other international institutions, and it's taken root. And if we believe people like Thomas Kuhn, who wrote about the structure of scientific revolutions, people who have that sort of dogmatic faith are very seldom convinced. The big ideas change by having the people who hold those ideas, what would you say, demographically replaced by time. The notion that a coercive antenatal population policy can bring great benefit to a country or society, I think is demonstrably incorrect on its face, and there's been an enormous amount of empirical evidence that has gathered about the awful unintended consequences of China's particular program. All of the demographers that I talked to who are Chinese demographers, all of them are unhappy with the program, and depending upon how outspoken they are, they will say either that they believe the program should be reconsidered, which is code language for scrapped, or that it should be scrapped outright. So within the Chinese demographic community at this point, there's not much disagreement about this. I suppose the question which arises is what happens if the ideologues actually achieve the world of their dreams through policies or through voluntary means. One of the most remarkable phenomena in the modern world has been the voluntary plunge of fertility in East Asia and in parts of Europe to levels that nobody would have thought could be seen apart from times of war and catastrophe. Peacetime, prosperous, voluntary, extreme subreplacement fertility. In Hong Kong today, birth rates voluntarily are hovering around 1 birth per woman per lifetime. They're lower than that in Taiwan today. They're lower than that in northern Italy today. And along with this extraordinary plunge in fertility, one's seeing another phenomenon, the rise of voluntary childlessness. In Germany today, in German-speaking Europe, almost a third of women are heading towards the end of their reproductive lives childless, voluntarily childless. In Hong Kong, almost one-third of the women in their early 40s are childless. And this portends a world in the future which is going to be very different from the one that we know. It's hard to see this as a sort of a new Jerusalem of prosperity and robustness for the future. My guess is that as the tidings come in on the consequences of extreme subreplacement fertility, it'll be impossible even for the most committed ideologues to see that this is a sort of a panacea for the world.
Either.
So I agree with Dr. Eberstadt. The notion of setting a global one-child policy as a goal is not just disturbing for a variety of reasons, but I think even in terms of the arithmetic, if one's concern is stabilizing global population, fundamentally misplaced. The fact is that fertility rates decline along with rising affluence, female educational attainment, and the availability of effective contraception. Though I think the biggest driver is probably female educational attainment. The global population will stabilize around by mid-century, and then plateau or gradually begin to decline. The problem is, for particularly for the rich world, is not bringing birth rates down. It's how to bring them back up again in some countries. And I think we need to think long and hard, not about why birth rates have fallen from 7 to 5 to 3 to 2, but why in some countries they've stabilized at 2, and at others they've fallen all the way to 1. Because in my view, a fertility rate around 2.0, particularly if supplemented by net immigration that's well assimilated, is just fine. But extreme subreplacement fertility leads to dramatic population aging and population implosion, and that creates big economic and social problems.
That's Jackson, you mentioned birth rates, the difference between birth rates and pregnancy rates.
I'm sorry, sir?
There is a difference between pregnancy rates
Yes.
and birth rates? Because birth rates, obviously, I mean, it is
Right.
still an issue of great contention here in the U.S. and elsewhere,
Right.
but I take the view that there's a child in the womb.
Right.
But it would seem that there's a huge number of women who are pregnant, 54 million in the U.S. alone since '73, who
Right.
have had abortions.
Yes, and that makes a very that has a very significant impact on the population trend. But one of the big and most important factors that does account for the variation in fertility across the rich world, it is the extent to which different societies do a good job at allowing women to have both jobs and families. In fact, the fertility rate and the female labor force participation rate have a relationship in the rich world today, which is probably the opposite of what most people think. Fertility is positively correlated with female labor force participation. Countries with the most working women who have, by and large, the most babies, and the countries with the fewest working women who have the fewest babies. And this, I believe, is because the aspirations of women have changed everywhere, but some countries have adapted the family culture and the workplace culture in a way that facilitates women to do both, and other countries haven't. So if a country doesn't, it ends up with both of less inputs, which is the case in Italy, Spain, the case in East Asia, in Korea, Taiwan, and the other tigers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, coming back to China briefly, it wasn't so long ago that the head of the UN Population Fund was talking openly about exporting China's one-child policy to the rest of the world. And indeed, one can see shadows of China's one-child policy in neighboring countries like Vietnam. So that was an organized institutional effort to promote the one-child model to other countries, not in a democratic fashion, not as a result of individual volition, but as a result of foreign-funded and imposed efforts. It is curious to me that the Chinese government seems so resistant to the notion that its one-child policy needs to be abandoned or at least seriously revised. And I can only attribute it to several factors, one of which is I think the one-child policy has, in a time of economic reform, been one way the state in China uses to maintain the muscular rigor, the muscular tone of the system, to maintain control in one area while relaxing it in the economic arena, while loosening controls on production and tightening controls on reproduction. I think they would also be loath to abandon the policy because it would undermine the legitimacy of the regime to admit, even implicitly, that this policy, which has impacted negatively every Chinese person throughout the last few decades, was in some measure a mistake or a miscalculation. And so if we do see the policy abandoned, I think it will be gradually eroded away rather than suddenly announced to have been a failure, a mistake, or bad timing. Of course, it is also difficult to abandon a policy that generates such enormous revenue for local and mid-level and even provincial officials, with the heavy fines that are now imposed on people who violate the policy, which are reportedly shared by officials at different levels of government. Those fines, which are equivalent to 3 to 5 years of family's income, the equivalent fine in the United States would be $250,000, $350,000. Provide generous bonuses, albeit illegal, to Chinese officials who collect them. So that's another reason why the existing bureaucracy would not want to move significantly away from the policy. The other thing I think that we need to address in order to return birth rates to replacement is the idea that people are somehow the enemy of the environment. There is an ideology out there that pits people against the environment, that measures environmental impact in terms of the human footprint, which in turn is a simple calculus in their view of how many human feet there are walking around on the planet. We need educational materials in schools that emphasize the value of the human resource. The environment is most under threat from poverty. It is poverty that causes the poor to cut down the last tree for fuel and to pollute the very water they need to drink because they have no resources to build a sewage treatment plant. The environment is most protected under an open society with a robust economy. It is most under threat from poverty and excessive state planning. So I do hope that we can change the view of people from consumers and parasites on the planet to producers who, in general, leave the world a better place than they found it. If you do the calculations of the present future value of a baby at conception, you find out that in an open society with a growing economy that value is always positive. And so every abortion is the death of a small fortune in these countries. It certainly is in China today. So we need to emphasize the value of each human being. I think that Hungary has taken a step in the right direction with its new constitution that defines life as beginning at conception and deserving of protection from that point. One may object that that sounds like a theological statement, but simply substitute value for the sanctity of life, the value of human life, and you'll see that it's an economic statement rather than necessarily a theological one. It's also true, of course, in biological terms that human life begins at conception. And when something is true at several different levels, it probably is true in the broadest sense.
Sure. Mr. Malash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask a question about the OSCE states in Africa. I'm particularly thinking of Mr. Jackson, but also the other panelists. What is the effect of this graying of the OSCE population on the other countries of the world, on the poorest countries? I'm getting from your testimony a vision of the OSCE in the future graying population, drawing workers from other countries. Presumably, I got some indication that a lot of these people would come from Africa. Then so we'd be in a situation where we'd be drawing probably Africa's best workers out of Africa, and what happens then to a place like Africa, South Asia? I mean, we can talk about the damage that Western immigration does to those countries right now. Not through any intention, of course, but the best and brightest of those countries tend to come to very often OSCE countries, and I'm wondering, will this be greatly magnified, and then what happens to Africa? I hope I'm wrong, but one could draw out of your testimony a kind of disaster vision for the rest of the world.
Right. Let me try to answer what are very good questions. I don't often disagree with Jack Goldstone, but perhaps this isn't a disagreement, but just a clarification. In the migration literature, a rising age dependency ratio or a falling worker support ratio would not draw in migrants from younger developing countries. It doesn't pull in migrants, and the reason is because a rising old age dependency burden is associated with the rising tax rate. So yes, in terms of emerging labor shortages, aging developed countries, OECD countries, need younger migrants, but they may not necessarily be, in the future, attractive places for migrants to move to. Now, Canada, the United States, and Australia are big exceptions. I'm thinking more of the rapidly aging countries of continental Europe with their very expansive and expensive welfare states. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that remains a sort of win-win dynamic in the future. I do think that immigration can be a win-win solution or part of the solution to the aging challenge. But there is an issue there that is often not taken into account by people who look at the issue. The other point I would make is that as domestic markets, to the extent that the rich countries are export markets for emerging markets, the contraction of these economies, and as I suggested in my testimony, the risk, the growing risk of protectionist measures does pose a real threat to growth in emerging markets. I sometimes say that global aging is a global problem, and so it requires global solutions. And I think at the heart of the solution has to be maintaining, renewing and reaffirming a commitment to open markets, both capital markets and labor markets, because in a world of diverging demographic trends where some countries are aging and contracting and others are still young and growing, it's open labor markets that allow us to match jobs and workers, and it's open capital markets that allow us to match savers and investment opportunities. So I think that's absolutely fundamental to a happy ending to the story.
Thank you, Mr. Rayburn.
I'd make a distinction between the economic implications of global migration flows and some of the social and political possibilities there. Although I wouldn't want to put an undue gloss on America's problems with integrating immigrants into our society as loyal and productive newcomers, we look pretty good over time compared to a lot of other places, as is also true of Canada and Australia, some of the overseas offshoots of the English-speaking world. Other places have more mixed records in integrating newcomers into their societies. And to the extent that receiving societies have problems in integrating and fully including newcomers in their societies, that creates a political and possibly a social problem for the future. And it can be an economic problem as well. I'm thinking most specifically about Japan, which seems almost to have an allergy against immigration from abroad. It counts people who've been living in Japan for 4 generations as foreigners in some cases. And in Europe, there's I'd say a mixed story. It's probably more successful than one often hears, but I don't think that all of the European states are as effective in integrating newcomers as the U.S., and that may pose long-term questions in some cases. From an economic standpoint, the economics of immigration, I think, looks pretty positive in a lot of cases. Because when one has what some would call a brain drain underway to rich countries, those brains who are drained are sending back remittances home. And their remittances home are a tremendously important source of income, poverty alleviation, capital funds for investment, and the like. In the contemporary world, the estimates that I've seen suggest that about $300 billion a year are being sent by immigrants in countries where they were not born back to their home countries, which is over twice as large a volume as all of the overseas development assistance in the world. And I venture to guess that it's money that's being spent an awful lot more wisely and a lot more effectively than international transfers of aid. To the extent that that international remittances are a consequence of this international migration flow, I'd see that as a very positive thing for an open world economy, the sort you describe.
Let me just ask a few final questions. And Dr. Eberstadt, let me ask you with regards to the UN estimates, how reliable are they? Certainly there's a surface appeal argument one could make when you say, oh, we're en route to 10 billion people. And yet if you don't know the stratification of age groups, and in the case of missing girls in places like China, the raw number really does not tell you all that much. How much weight can we give to the credibility of those numbers? And secondly, like Mr. Mosier mentioned earlier, I've heard for my entire career in Congress, that's 3 decades, 31 years, this mantra of overpopulation, overpopulation. I heard it before I got here. I hear it at every UN conference I ever go to, and I've been to many of them. I was at Cairo Population Conference. I was at the Beijing Women's Conference, PrepComs, Summit on Children. There's this thread that nobody seems to challenge, or this unexamined truism that we are just exploding with people. And Dr. Jackson, you talked about after 2050 that we are likely to go into some decline. Maybe you could elaborate on to what that decline actually looks like. Because I think most Americans and most people around the world would be shocked to contemplate what this means to them in terms of their quality of life, their standard of living. Some people have gotten used to a certain standard. Well, that could erode very quickly. And secondly, Dr. Eberstadt, if you could speak to the White Death in Russia. You mentioned 3 million deaths for every 2 million births. You said there's a 50% decline in military manpower by 2050. Surely Beijing is watching that very closely as well. And with such a large shared border, it would seem to me that the Russians ought to be very concerned about illegal and migration across those borders in huge numbers. Who's going to stop it, particularly in 2025 and 2030 and beyond, when that military capability on the Russians' part has been so degraded?
Yes, sir. Very briefly, I can attest that the technical people who work at the UN Population Division are very, very good. They've been trained very well. They do their work very carefully. The great unanswerable question for the United Nations or the Census Bureau or anyone else is how fertility and childbearing patterns will progress in the generations ahead. Because, simply put, there's no robust science that allows anybody to accurately forecast future patterns of childbearing. And this means that the figure one puts into the black box or into the computer will generate whatever results you implicitly command it to give you. So that the current projections coming out from the UN Population Division and the U.S. Census Bureau and anywhere else is in effect a sort of a Rorschach test. You ask demographers what sounds reasonable to you as a future trajectory, and you put that in, and then you get out total numbers. The fact of the matter is that after you look more than 30 years in the future, you're making guesses about how many babies the currently unborn are going to have. And there just isn't any scientific way of doing that reliably. And so the United Nations Population Division tries to cover a number of different possibilities. Its low variant suggests that the world's population total will start declining around 2050. Its high shows things going up forever. But there's no way that anyone can possibly know. And there's a big uncertainty there that's just worth emphasizing. Unfortunately, it isn't always emphasized. As to this notion of overpopulation, the real problem with the concept, I think, is that it's impossible to describe a, quote, overpopulated, unquote, country with any consistency or without ambiguity using demographic variables. I mean, what's the measure of overpopulation? Is it population density? In that case, Monaco looks awfully overpopulated. It doesn't stop people from wanting to go there. If it's rapid population growth, the United States around Ben Franklin's time would have been awfully overpopulated. You can just go through the list, and none of these criteria give you the vision that people seem to have when they start talking about overpopulation, because what they really mean is poverty. They're talking about poor places. And this is a fallacy of composition. Yes, you see poverty in populations because you have to have people to have poverty, but you also have to have people to have wealth. So I think the concept of overpopulation is a pretty useless one, and economists who deal with population never use it. They really never use it. As for what's going on with Russia and its security questions, it's the demographic vacuum that, if you will, is emerging in the Russian Far East, the drop in its military and other young manpower ages, and the problems of its shrinking but still very debilitated, sick labor force. The Kremlin has some programs for trying to deal with these. I don't think they've been terribly effective so far. There's a pronatalist policy that seems, according to some lights, to have slightly increased Russia's fertility. We'll see if fertility continues to increase. Health has come up slightly, but maybe is still below the levels for adult people in the country of India and I think in Pakistan. Russia is on an almost irremediable trajectory for decreased relative economic influence in the world over the next 2 decades. And the Kremlin has responded to this prospect with a new security concept, as they call it. And to oversimplify, but I think only a bit, the new security concept talks about lowering the threshold at which the Kremlin would consider use of nuclear weapons. And this is the essence of the new Russian security concept. It takes into account the likelihood that Russia will be economically weaker in comparison to its competitors rather than stronger in the years ahead, and tries to deal with this not through outward integration or through economic reforms at home, but through the use of Russia's comparative advantage in nuclear weaponry. Yes, sir.
Should the Chinese move, that the threshold is or going to be lowered, at which time they might use nuclear weapons to prevent such a movement militarily by China?
Over the last almost 20 years, there's been a really dramatic movement of Russian citizens out of the Russian Far East and into warmer, more hospitable areas of the country. The Russian Far East has seen about 1 in 6 people leave voluntarily. So many of the people who were there before were there involuntarily as a result of police force, the Gulag, and all of the rest. The Russian Far East's population continues to decline, and it could be that the economically rational thing would be to see it decline yet further. How many people does one need to man and operate a number of wellheads and energy centers, mines? I don't know. What's striking to me in looking at the China-Russia border is how little interaction there is between the two sides. There are some guesses, no real hard figures, about how many people from China are coming into the Russian Far East, but the number probably is not higher than in the low hundreds of thousands, and most of those are sort of temporary traders, peddlers, and the like. I'm not sure that the Russian Far East is any more attractive as a long-term retirement area or residence area to people from warmer China than it is to people from frozen Russia. It's not clear that people from China wish to live there voluntarily any more than people from Russia do. The area has very little trade, surprisingly little trade, over a very long border, very little integration between the two sides. As I said, my Russian demographer counterparts believe that it is not viable over the long term for this area to be an integral part of a Russian federation, but they don't have any particular scenarios that I've heard about how a big change like this would come about. And obviously that is, on their part, quite speculative. They're not talking about anything that they forecast in the next number of decades. It's more like science fiction.
Just 2 final questions, if I could. First, do any of these projections take into, obviously, one couldn't predict a catastrophic event like we have with HIV/AIDS, the pandemic, or perhaps SARS, or what we saw happen in Japan, or the rise of the superbugs. Is there any wiggle room in demographic projections that say, should an event happen, this could add or decrease our projections? And secondly, on Thursday, another hat that I wear is that I'm chairman of the Africa Global Health, Global Human Rights Subcommittee, and I'm going to be chairing the first ever hearing on the global problems and that are presented by Alzheimer's disease globally. Europe, the EU, has about 9 million currently acknowledged cases, and that's rising. We're at a little over 5 million, and that's expected to triple by 2050, unless there's some cure found or delay of onset, which would put the number out a little bit. But I'm wondering if what your thoughts are on Alzheimer's. I looked at the projections that you had on, I think it was Dr. Jackson, on life expectancy, and obviously in Europe and the United States it's very high, 80, 79. And we know that in America, 1 out of every 2 people, once they're at the age of 85, are in some degree of Alzheimer's disease. So if you could maybe speak to that issue as well, because it seems to me from a cost point of view, and we'll have better information on Thursday when our witnesses provide that for us, this carries huge implications to Medicare, the European equivalent, and of course to all the caregivers who spend huge amounts of time, family members especially, caring for an Alzheimer's patient.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The need to care for a much larger number of frail and a much larger number of elders with dementia is probably the most explosive dimension of old age dependency. First of all, it's not just that the elderly population as a whole is growing, it's the oldest elderly age brackets that are the fastest growing age brackets, a phenomenon sometimes called the aging of the aged. There is also, and I think Nicholas Aberstadt may be able to speak more authoritatively to this, but I have seen little evidence to suggest that rates of chronic morbidity, of incidence of chronic conditions among the elderly, including Alzheimer's, are falling. Indeed, they seem to be stable or rising. And so this poses an enormous challenge in the future, which will be compounded by the fact that the size and shape of the family is changing, because even in countries which do have some government funded support for long-term care, a vast amount of care occurs informally within families. Yet in a country like Italy, by the time you get out to the 2030s, the extended family is essentially extinct. Half of young adults don't have any brothers or sisters or uncles or aunts or cousins. So this is a huge problem. Just very briefly on the issue of wild cards, no, the projections by the United Nations and others make some attempt to factor in obviously existing pandemics, but they don't include or reflect the possibility of unforeseen catastrophes which are not in the pipeline. But I might just conclude by saying that absent a true catastrophe, a global pandemic, or some Hollywood event like an alien invasion or a colliding comet, global aging is going to happen. That is baked into the cake at this point, sir.
One of the happy facts that has transformed the world over the last generation and more has been the explosion in health that almost all of the human population has enjoyed, Russia, parts of Africa being the sad exceptions. And this explosion of health has continued not just from infancy through working age, but into older ages, so that life expectancy has been increasing, as Dr. Jackson indicated, for people in their 70s, their 80s, even into their 90s in the developed world. And rates of physical disability have been more or less steadily declining for people in the developed world in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. The terrible footnote and exception to this is dementia. And as Dr. Jackson indicated, there are no data to suggest that the prevalence or incidence of dementia has been declining over time. We don't have any indication that it has been increasing, but our medical efforts to combat dementia have been, until now, essentially completely unsuccessful. And as far as I can tell, there is nothing in the pipeline, that in a research pipeline, that offers any real promise of progress in this area. Places like Japan are facing a terrible problem in the future. If projections turn out to describe a future reality, which they may or may not, we see a situation only a little more than a generation away in which 1 out of every 25 Japanese is afflicted with Alzheimer's. 1 out of 25. And at the same time, a world in which, as Dr. Jackson indicated, something like 40% of all Japanese end up childless. Now, how does a society like that function? The situation is a little bit less acute for some of the European countries and distinctly less acute for the United States, but the trends don't look very inviting for us either.
Senator Gordon? Chairman.
I hope the hearing was more positive than that last response. If it wasn't, then I'm sorry. Then I'm not sorry I missed it. If it was, then I look forward to reading the material as I will. And I thank you all for your being here, and thank the chairman for holding this hearing.
Anything else any of our distinguished witnesses would like to add before we close? I do want to thank you. I think this is an issue, especially as it relates to Congress and other parliaments, that has been totally, maybe not totally, but largely, almost totally ignored for far too long. As, again, Mr. Mosier mentioned earlier before, when everyone talked about population, it would be the uninformed view that we are overpopulated and not what portends. And it's right around the corner with regards to huge economic dislocations, potentials of war attributable to a very, very worsening situation when it comes to a disproportionately older versus a younger population. Your information that you've provided and the scholarship you've provided to this commission is brilliant. And we look forward to sharing it with our colleagues because the analysis needs to be gotten out into the public domain and into the policy-making domain much more robustly than it has been. So thank you so much for your testimony. Your written and your oral statements were, like I said, brilliant, and your answers to the questions very incisive. So do thank you so much. Anything you want to add? So I thank you, and the hearing is adjourned.